This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/rubyrogues. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have Dave Kimura.
Hey everybody.
David Richards.
Hey, hey.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week we're going to be talking about standards versus reality. And I kind of love the idea, right? It's like, how realistic is it to expect all these standards?
Especially for somebody like me who doesn't like any standards usually.
Yeah, well, before the show, Dave pointed out, because I was like, well, I don't have, he said something about, his standards, and I was like, I don't have standards either. And he's like, well, number one, make it work. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much how I operate in a lot of ways, right? Does it run? Does it make money? I don't know. Sometimes I don't think about it much beyond that. Should I be?
It's such a touchy subject for a lot of people, I think, because, you have some people who say, use tabs and not spaces. Other people say use spaces, not tabs. And that's getting more over to just the appearance of the code. But if you're having to do code reviews and read the code online on GitHub, GitLab, or whatever, then appearance does have some play into it. And I think that's where it kind of starts, because I was doing a code review the other day and they were using tabs. I'm like, that's not good. Like it looks horrible on my screen. Like, why are you using spaces? And it just kind of I caught myself off guard, because I was like, you know what? That's their style and it's their project. They can do it however they want. It shouldn't matter. But I think that's where a lot of the controversy comes in, is because we have our own family of origin, if you will. And what I mean by that is our background on how we grew up coding or how we learned coding and the practices that we fell into. Maybe our employer or mentor had their own practices that we adopted. And so we kind of have taken these set of standards as truths. And from that, we then judge or we condemn others for breaking those standards that we have created for ourselves. And while it's not right or wrong per se to say that, hey, you have these standards, they're different than mine, and that's okay, as long as we are accomplishing a common goal. I think that it gets into a bit more of an issue when we're talking about peer programming, where you have multiple people working on the same project. Then you have to conform as a team to a set of standards so that you're not blindsided every time you open up a separate file or something.
I agree with you. I wonder, though, a little bit, taking it to the next level. We have team projects, and generally, I've been on teams as large as 10 developers. I know there are larger teams out there. But, and if you can reduce the communication load, that's where a lot of these standards come in, right? I don't have to think about how this works. It all just formats nicely into my editor or my IDE, and it just works, right? And so that's nice. But what about community projects where you have such a disparate set of people coming in and working on it? Do we have community standards? Or is it the same deal, right? That team sets the standard for that project. And so if I contribute to 2 different open source projects, I may wind up working with 2 different sets of standards.
Well, I like that because like Dave was saying, these standards come from somewhere, and I bet that a lot of this is, it's maybe a little less about the standard of what it looks like on the screen and more about, the structure that holds the team and the project together. Mm-hmm. That if I can jump on a project and contribute and not slow anybody else down, I don't know if I should admit this publicly, but I joined a project once, and we had a standard for some documentation that was in line that was auto-generated. And I jumped on a very large project, and my first commit was I forced this standard on everybody, which was like 5,000 lines of code, or 5,000 files were changed, and probably 20. You didn't. I did. I did this terribly. And I'm like, why did you do that? Well, it's cleaner, right? And I didn't even talk to anybody about it. And people were nice enough that they said, okay, fine, it's not terrible, but it was a bad idea.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah.
That's rough. I mean, and I've seen this on sort of private company repos too, right? Somebody decides that all the JavaScript has to be indented 4 spaces instead of 2. And if that all goes into its own commit, okay, maybe. But then, if you pull that commit out and merge stuff from the future, it gets messy really fast.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's crazy because these kinds of standards are really asking the question, who's the boss? If I can enforce this on the whole team, then I get to assert at least some sort of tacit control or leadership. And that maybe isn't useful for the project, delivering something worthwhile, getting it to work and making money.
Yeah, and I think there's also the issue of the old standards that were set when we were young and then just never change. Even in the Ruby linter, they still have the 80 character limit for the rows. I'm like, no, I have a 4K monitor, I have a 1440p monitor. My laptop has great resolution that I can scale back. I don't want to have just a quarter of my screen be the code and stuff. So I think that we also run into issues where there has been old standards that are just commonly known and commonly accepted, but no one's ever challenged them in the past 20 years or something. So I have very few lines of code that are hit the 80 characters if it needs to be more. Sometimes for readability, I will, make it a multi-line method, if it has some long method names or whatever the case. But I think that, that's the other half of the issue is we're not challenging old standards based on current technology.
Oh, yeah. And I get away with a lot of that because, in the culture of software, I think that I cut my teeth a lot of years ago writing C code. So a lot of the standards were to make C run. That has nothing to do with things we're writing today. But I'll train somebody up new and they just kind of accept whatever I tell them. And I don't think usually about what I'm telling them. Things like, oh, yeah, just do it this way. And yeah, maybe it's a bad idea.
Yeah, David's code is riddled with structs.
You're not making that up.
I was, but if it's true, it's even funnier.
It's true. I've removed a lot of structs from my code. Sometimes I think, what am I doing? That's no. I haven't learned anything new in the last 20 years. What can I say?
Yeah, but I agree. Dave's point, you're right, for the 80 lines of code. If I'm working on my laptop, I don't want to squint at it that much. So 80 characters wide is kind of, it's kind of nice sometimes. Or if I want to split the screen, right? So I'm using Emacs and I split it vertical or horizontal. I have a line down the middle with 2 buffers on either side. And so 80 characters is, hitting that limit, it makes it wrap. But the flip side of it is that, it's not necessarily a major issue, and I can change the font size and still read it fine on most of the monitors. It's only when I'm traveling or, really stuck on my laptop that it matters. So if that's not generally my programming experience, then it may not matter. And challenging that, right? So you may have a whole team of people that are working on ginormous iMacs or 4K screens. And yeah, so for that team, I mean, that limitation is kind of silly. But at the same time, it's how are we thinking about these problems, and is there a better way to do it? And this is one of the things I really like about agile development. I don't know if we call it out often enough, is that agile development is, where you sit down and you look at your process and you say, what can we do better? And you try new things and you figure out what makes the process better and you evolve. And that's what makes it agile. And, okay, well, let's try it without the 80 character limit and see what happens. Oh, well, it turned out it was really painful, so we're going to switch back. Or maybe, it didn't matter, so why bother worrying about it? Because all of these different standards are overhead, right, to writing the code. I mean, it's not just, we all communicate well about how the code needs to look or how it needs to go together or how we architect systems or any of this stuff. We're short-circuiting communication there, right? We're all on the same page about a lot of this stuff. That's what standards do for you. But they're rules, they're overhead, they're things that you have to think about while you write your code. And so if you can remove that mental burden, maybe you can move a little faster, write a little bit better code.
Yeah, and I think that you've definitely touched on some good points there, and that almost segues into the architecture of your application. You have your standard, if we're talking Rails, you have your standard MVC project, but then you have something that goes a bit outside of scope of those, like a decorator or a service object or something else, whether it's a background job. And those really don't fit into the MVC structure. So what do you do from there? For a lot of my projects, I have the standard model folder, controller folder, views folder, but then also have the jobs, services, decorators, a lot of other things where I've kind of containerized different business logic into their own little subspace. So I think that some of the standards, if we were to stick to the core MVC, is like, well, if you have something that's a class, it needs to go into the models folder. Well, for me, I don't like that kind of thinking because my models I reserve for anything that has a persistent storage, that writes to the database. I might have a concerns file, which is a includes or inheritance for something else, but for the most part, anything that gets stored on the database goes into my models folder. That class does. And anything that doesn't, whether it is a something else, a different class, a service object or whatever, then I'll find a different place for it to go.
I think that's interesting. One thing that I wonder about, though, too, going into Rails is we make the distinction, right? It persists to the database. But the flip side of that is that we also tend to mix a lot of other functionality into our models, or at least a lot of people do. And so maybe the database distinction isn't the most important distinction on those classes, even though they inherit from Active Record. And so, even then, it's okay, so are these models or are they something else? Or do we just use the models for persistence and then use other functionality and value objects to build things on top of that? And those are standards that I've seen people argue about. And so, even then, breaking out of MVC for like uploaders and jobs and things is one thing, but even then, what we traditionally think of as a model, do we set a standard around that so that we even think about that differently and don't define things specifically as models?
Well, I like how this shows us that, sometimes a standard is a stand-in for I don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. That we'll talk about it as what's the good idea when it's time to engage, or how do we really want to architect our project. But then at the same time, it's also acting as a yes, but it's handled, or I know where to look, or it'll work consistently. That it should scale about the same and test about the same and work about the same as everything else. So that does have a stand-in, even if I don't have the right idea, or if I accept somebody else's best idea, even though I don't like it. Sometimes it's just, I don't want to think about that. Let me do something else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for a long time, this was a few years ago, they said skinny controller fat models. That was kind of like this lingo or saying that people had, where your controllers should not be really big. They should be real small, not many lines of code, but you should put all that business logic into your models. So the models was just a dumping ground for logic. And while that didn't, yeah. And for small models, I still do that. Models that don't have a lot of business logic, they are literally just storing information. I'm recalling the information. They may have a couple of validations. They might have a couple of scopes. They might have a couple of instance methods. Mm-hmm. But anything beyond that, where it starts getting much, much more complicated to where it's 500-600 lines of code, it needs to get extracted. That file needs to get refactored, because if you go back in there a few weeks later, you're completely lost. You don't know what ties to what. You don't know where to look for something. Yeah, you can do a control find and find kind of the area that you need to look at, but you don't know what else you're going to affect. And tests are good, and they're going to get you some amount of coverage, but the ramp up time to actually fixing the problem or changing that feature, you can't fix without refactoring.
And Dave, you're giving us kind of this reality check, right? So how do you handle that on a routine basis? I mean, do you have rules for that? Is there a standard for that? Or is it just kind of this feels gross, I'm going to ungross it?
I think it's situational. So in a lot of my projects that I do, I use SearchKick and Elasticsearch. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of validations on the models. And I also have a lot of associations. And each one of those separately are 50, 60 lines of code. And in the model, that just gets overwhelming sometimes. So the first thing I'll do is let's try to get the best bang for the buck, reduce the size of that model so I can actually get in there and actually read what's going on. So I'll move those over into a separate folder. So for like a users model, I'll create a users folder. I'll dump that into the concerns of the model's directory. And then I would just include, I'll create a file called validations under that users folder. I'll create one called SearchKick. I'll create one called associations. And then I'll just include those in the actual user.rb model. And while that doesn't actually solve a problem per se, as far as extracting or refactoring the code, it does extract it to where the file is much smaller. It's going to be easier for me to read. And if I'm consistent, then if I need to go look at validations or something, I know where to go look, because I have a convention of my naming structure, and it should be clear to other developers as well who has a look at that file.
This is reminding me of a conference I attended years ago where we were talking about exactly this on a user's model. And some people were really upset with that solution. And they tended to be managers or owners of companies that were upset. And the people that were writing the code tended to feel like, hey, that solved my problem. And ended up into a kind of an interesting conversation where I started to see there's this difference between kind of the administrative perspective and the operative perspective. Mm-hmm. That the person closest to the code, I think the person closest to the code usually should win, unless there's a really good reason to hand control over to somebody further away. So if you're going to maintain it or test it or build the next feature, your vote counts more than somebody who just has to pay the salary, even though paying the salary is not a small thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is, basically the levels of efficiency you get out of that, right? And So the person who has to deal with it most often is going to be the person that benefits most from the structure. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense. One question that I'm wondering about, though, with something like this is, how do you actually manage a lot of this, this complexity that you're adding in as far as file structure goes? So I guess the question that I'm really driving at is, I'm wondering here, this is something that you want to do consistently across your app, right? When things get to a certain level of consistency, you want to move it up or move it out to these other responsibilities, these other files, these other classes, however you think about that. So as you're doing that, I mean, how do you enforce that? How do you push it around? We talked a lot about code look and feel and things like that. And you have things like Rubocop and Ruby linters that will do a lot of that stuff. But when you're talking about this kind of structure, is there a way to enforce it? Is there a way to kind of raise the flag and say, hey, this file is too big, this class is too long, stuff like that? Or should you?
So for me, I think the best I have is a rule of thumb, but what I do and what I train people to do is that if it's hard to test, it's time to move it. And so if it's getting really complicated in there, things start getting harder to test. So there's a practical reason to move it. And so I'll usually start with, here's a basic Rails app, say, on a Rails project. And then here are my models with some business logic. And that's usually where things get complicated. And so then I'll pull some of the logic out of that, either in concerns or service objects. And then as they get to be too many, I do what Dave does, and I'll create a directory around groups of them. And then when that gets to be too much, then I'll go ahead and extract out a whole service and just have the two services talk to each other. At some point, they have a completely distinct purpose. So things do grow that way, I think. And I just feel like if I can't test it, then it's got to move. Find a way to move it someplace where it's more testable. And then it starts to make sense, too, in my head of, oh, that's a reasonable chunk of code. The abstraction is reasonable enough. I can explain that to the next person fairly quickly.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it, David. This one time I had a method that was 600 lines long. It was a behemoth. It was in my earlier days.
Over here.
It was so horrible. And any change, even though there were some tests, any change broke the test, no matter what. It was guaranteed. And it was absolutely horrible. So I ended up refactoring it, but in the process of refactoring it, each method was maybe 20 lines of code, but then I had 1,000 lines of code. Mm-hmm. But the thing is about that, even though I grew the complexity as far as the number of lines of code in that particular class, I reduced the complexity of being able to read it, maintain it, manage it, and be able to add new features. So overall, I think it was a positive refactor, and while still getting the same result, most importantly, but it reduced the complexity, even though adding some other complexity. So I think it is a give and take. If you're extracting things over to a different folder, then you lose visibility, because now you have to go open up a different file to see what's in there. What are my links or associations or validations? So it's a give and take on what's going to be your best bang for the buck. When I open the file and I look at it, what's the most important thing for me to see? Is it the validations? In that case, keep the validations in that file and extract something else.
Yeah, I guess what I'm driving at here, though, is because I agree with you. I agree with both of you on kind of the way that code grows and the ways, the techniques that you're using to manage this stuff. But what I generally want is I want something that's going to actually get in my face when I violate it, right? So I want a tool that's going to say, hey, your 600 line method is bad, right? Go fix it. Or your class is getting rather long. Do you want to take the next step and start breaking out responsibilities? And I've seen like Code Climate does this, and some, there are a few other tools. There are some gems that, they run the complexity things and, things like that. Or maybe you do have a rule of thumb where it's like, look, testing this is really hairy, or maybe, we have frequent breakages on the test. And so if the test fails on it, after, 3 consecutive changes or something, but I want something that's tracking all this and at the end of the day going, hey, Chuck, you did something kind of dumb, or hey, Chuck, you went and you made it work, but you probably weren't thinking about this particular aspect of things, and then make me do it. So, I mean, are there things that you do to enforce this, or to give you cues, or do you just kind of have to program your own head to go, oh, this was a pain to test, or, I updated this test and it was a pain to test, and these are the kinds of situations that make me want to refactor it out.
Yeah, and I think you can do that with Rubicop. So, if you need to, you can create your own custom method that's a validator for it. So whenever you commit your code or something, if you had something like Code Climate reading that YAML file or whatever, then it's going to be able to pick those things up and, fail the code.
Right.
And one thing I find about Rubicop, it's interesting, is it's kind of a whole nother thing, right? Like I can work on code and have an idea of what I want to do or what I want to train somebody. But if I'm going to start to enforce my ideas with a linter, now it's a collaborative decision-making process. Now it's let's finish this agile process and talk about things and work together. Because now I'm really saying, hey, I'm going to stretch my thoughts into your editor, and I'm in the way. And I know that can go really, really wrong sometimes when somebody said, hey, you know what? I won't allow a method longer. I was at another conference once where somebody said he will not accept any code that has more than 5 lines in it. That was his hard and fast rule, and he preferred 3. Define something, end it, one-liners. And he was a real tyrant. It seems people in the room, he told that to the room, and a lot of people, the whispering near my table was, I'm glad I don't work for that guy. His intention is he wanted clarity, but once we start enforcing our best intentions on somebody else's thought process, we better have a relationship with them and a conversation.
Well, and the thing that I'm getting from what you're saying is, he wanted clarity, and he defined the standard for clarity, right? Because we have this ideal, right? It's clarity, it's maintainability, it's clean code, it's testability. And then we define it down to 3-line methods or 5-line methods. And that's not always the same thing, but I don't know that we always have a good surrogate for those things either, right? That we can actually read, test, and enforce.
Yeah. Plus, we're introducing a whole nother thing. If I just say I want to have smaller things, now I have to think more about interfaces and what the calls really data types. There's a lot of other problems to solve once I start to break it out.
Not only that, but I think in that case we have a misinterpretation of what Sandy Metz said. So I love a lot that Sandy Metz does, and I think that she has brought a lot of great practices to the Ruby community. However, I think that what people do is they're like, oh, Sandy Metz said this, we have to do this. Like, what would Sandy Metz do? Like, it is now the law. And that's where people get into trouble. It's that they're not understanding what she meant. She didn't say you have to keep your methods 5 lines or less. She said that as a concept of don't have 600-line methods because you're not going to be able to maintain it. So aim for 5. If you have to go to 6, if you have to go to 20, you know what? That's okay. In my book. It's okay.
Yeah.
Don't make it 600.
I use it as a breakpoint, right? So it's, I've got a 6 or 7 line method here. Do I need it to be 6 or 7 lines? Do I need to break it up? Or is it clearer this way? And at least then I have the mental conversation with myself and I make a decision on it instead of just letting it kind of, now it's 10 lines. Well, now it's 15 lines. Now it's got, a switch statement and 2 if statements in it, and so it's getting more and more complex. It just, this is a longer method. I need to at least, kind of trigger that breakpoint in my head to go, why? or what? And that way I can come back to it and go, okay, this needs to change before it becomes really hard to change. Because I can imagine a 600-line method is a real pain to refactor. But a 20-line method, if I break that up into 2 or 3 shorter methods, is a whole lot easier to deal with. And so if I can catch it before it gets too large or too crazy, that's where these rules come in. But sometimes I need I'm so sucked into the problem that I'm not thinking about the code, if that makes sense. As a developer, you love building things that are fun and that matter. Me too. Do you want to add authentication to yet another app? Do you want to stay updated with all the security issues and patch them? Why not leave it to the experts? Auth0 is the easiest and fastest way to implement real-world authentication and authorization architectures into your apps and APIs. Allow your users to log in with either regular username and password, social identity providers like Facebook and Twitter, or enterprise identity providers like Active Directory, Office 365, etc. Or without passwords, with an email login like Slack or phone login like WhatsApp. Getting started is very easy. Add authentication to your Ruby app or Rails app, Sinatra, and others in less than 10 minutes by writing only a few lines of code. No credit card required. Get the free plan or try the enterprise plan for 21 days at auth0.io/rubyrogues. That's the number 0 in Auth0. Auth0 is trusted by developers at Atlassian, Mozilla, Bluetooth, Optimizely, Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Try it out at auth0.io/rubyrogues. Remember, that's the number 0 in Auth0. And get back time building core features.
Oh, yeah. Just think about Dave, I'm just thinking what it felt like to write 600-line method. I mean, you were in that problem, and then to be yanked around and say, wait a minute, I've just been thinking through 100 different things, and now I've got to think about 100 more different things, to refactor this and clean it up. That's a tough thing.
Yeah.
There's another. Oh, go ahead.
No, and it actually wasn't too difficult to refactor because I knew what my entry point was and I knew what the return was. So I just deleted everything and rewrote the file.
Yeah.
Rewrote it and made sure that I got the exact same results that I was previously. And, from that standpoint, it wasn't too bad. But generally, my limit is 40 lines.
Mm-hmm.
And if I find that I'm doing duplication within that one method, then I extract those duplications out into a separate method, and that 40 line becomes, 20 or something. So that's kind of like my standard or my rule of thumb on things, is that duplication is bad from some standpoints, where if you make one change in one file, then you have to go to these other 3 files to make the same changes, or to these other 3 parts of the method to make changes. And that's where you start getting yourself into trouble, because you remember it today to make those changes in multiple places. You're not going to remember it in the tomorrow whenever you're going back to that file. Unless if you have a really good memory, but the next developer who touches it will not.
I'm kind of dumb, so the tomorrow is literally tomorrow. I won't remember. But yeah, that totally makes sense. One thing that you said kind of reminded me of a talk by Katrina Owen, where it's called Therapeutic Refactoring, and she gave it, several years ago. But yeah, you put the inputs in, you know what the output should be, and then you can write those characterization tests around it, and then you can, start to break out the problems, make sure you're still getting the same result as you test the other pieces as you write them. So, a lot of positive things there. But yeah, it's interesting. And I think, just talking about this, I feel a little bit of conflict over where each of us have our line. It's not conflict in the sense that we're angry with each other, but we all have different opinions, right? And we have our video on, and I could see a little bit of body language, where somebody says 5 lines and somebody else looks a little uncomfortable with that, and so Dave says 40 lines, and I'm sitting here going, 40 lines is a really long method, right? And I mean, that's where a lot of this comes in. Is, what, the amount of complexity I want to hold in my head, typically 40 lines is way too much. And, and so if Dave and I are working on the same bit of code, then maybe we do need to bring that down a little bit, just so that everybody's happy working in it. But if Dave's working on his own project, or he's working with a bunch of people where their line is 100 lines of code, I mean, again, you have to have that conversation, but once you have it and once you know where the line is and maybe you experiment with it a little bit, you can really figure out, okay, I don't have to think about this anymore, because if I go over what we agreed on, I'm going to get prompted to change it.
And one thing I've noticed, I like that. And one thing I've noticed too, just beyond getting to that level for myself, is in healthy teams, there's a lot of, during code review or pull requests, there's a lot of either bragging or complaining about our own code. And what we're actually doing there is we're talking gently about the standards we like or hate and finding ways to adjust them, several times a day or throughout the week. So that healthy dialogue of, okay, yeah, I wrote this. Let me tell you, I wrote this. It's starting to get a little long on the method. We're picking on particular things, but that is a very common thing. Yeah, it's starting to get along here. I'm not really sure about that. And then we get into standards conversations without it getting too heavy or too long.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I'm curious about now that we've kind of hit a lull is a lot of the code that I do is just me, right? I'm working on some stuff around podcasting and podcast sponsorships. I'm probably going to pull in a couple of, I don't even want to say beta, like alpha minus users on this software, right? But as I'm building it, I'm curious, should I be setting up some of these standards, Rubocop, metric foo, whatever's out there, right? Should I be running that stuff now as I build it out, even though it's just me?
I would say yes-ish, and this is why. And I would have said no a month ago. But I've had a project like that started to go funky on me. And so what I've noticed is that when it's my own project, I'm a little more lax with myself. I know what I'm doing. Nobody else is going to care. It does its job. But I've got a project that I haven't touched in a few months, and it needs a few small refactors. And day after day, I just look at that and I don't get to it. And so there's got to be some future me that needs to come back and wring my neck a little bit and say, yeah, you don't have to do everything here, but I would say some things, there is a point where a project will cross the line and it just becomes a pain to maintain. It's very maintainable. I understand it. I just don't want to. And that's a line that I don't think I want to cross again. Right. I think that's too expensive to try to come back and force myself to do what I don't want to do.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Dave? I know you work on some projects on your own. I think you mentioned a budgeting app or something on some episodes.
Yeah. So I don't like using Rubocop or linters and stuff just because they usually are more distracting. Probably because I don't have good standards. But but the code I write, my main thing is make it readable. Make it to where when I do come back to it, that I'm going to be able to understand it, or at least with a minimal amount of time be able to touch it. And one thing I started doing, which I didn't do even a year ago, is I started thinking, having someone over my shoulder watching me, just having that invisible person watching me, and have them like cast their judgment on what I'm writing. Like, would that person say like, whoa, what are you doing here? Or they say, you know what, that's good enough. That can be readable. And I think that's kind of where we need to get to, is where it's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you're able to read it today, if you're able to read it tomorrow, and if it's not introducing if it's not introducing technical debt, then that's good enough, because your primary focus, and you're not getting paid to write beautiful code. You're getting paid to write something that works. And I think a lot of times, if you do have too many standards, you lose focus on that. Your productivity, your throughput goes way down because you're having to conform to these standards. Mm-hmm. So I think it's mostly, how quickly can you get it done correctly?
I think there's another facet to that as well, which is for me easy to overlook. I tend to be senior on any team I'm on, And so usually if I have a standard I want, I usually get it. But there's it makes it hard to be inclusive. If somebody new is coming on board, or it's just done this way, and if there's a few of these things, that's fine. But if there's a lot of these things, the new people really feel left out. They feel like they can't get it all, or they can't wrap their mind around all the things that are being asked. And then it becomes a little bit more combative, or a little bit more difficult. And especially if we're thinking about inclusivity, I've got some people I really want to work with on some projects, but they don't have a lot of experience. And I'm trying to figure out what's in the way to bring these people into the projects. And some of it is this kind of thing. It's like, yeah, we wrote all this code and we had all these standards, and there's 10,000 rules they need to know before they can write line one. And it just is not a very easy project to bring somebody into.
Absolutely. And especially if it's a large project, because now, number one, they're overwhelmed by the size of the project and all the different intricacies in it. Now you're enforcing all these standards that they're going to have to, do as well. I mean,
yep.
I'm not saying that you're by no means, by any stretch of the imagination, I'm saying that, you should just write sloppy code just because you're afraid you might hurt someone's feelings. But, we do have to draw a line somewhere, and, for me, I put my line at 40 lines of code. That's kind of where I draw my line that, hey, anything else, it's not maintainable. That's why I have that limit. I don't strive for 40 lines. I try to make sure that my code is under 40 lines, each method.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing that I just want to bring up too is that, Dave mentioned all of the, maybe you have a lot of rules. I've seen people put them into style guides, and that's also mental overhead, right? Because then you have to go and you have to look at the style guide to make sure that you're doing it right. And so, yeah, it's a lot to know, and there's a lot to know in here's how we work, and there's a lot to know as in, how this is how everything goes together to get the job done.
I think that ThoughtBot did a nice happy median where they said they wrote a playbook and they just described how they like to do things and why it matters. And it's short enough somebody could read that as they're coming onto a project or a team and get it. And so I like that idea. Hey, these are our plays. This is our playbook. This works. And then, hey, come bring what you are to the team, and that seems to come up for me, at least. I've noticed sometimes we have a clash of the titans on a project where you have strong personalities, senior developers, where there's one right way to do things. And so if we have a playbook, or we have general principles we're after, we can have conversations and come up with something a little bit easier instead of trying to say, yep, these are the 500 practices that absolutely must be, or it's a terrible project.
And, I was talking with one of our other developers about something where, I kind of saw what they were doing, and, I went and corrected them. And this is kind of one of my pet peeves, is that we shouldn't break the convention over configuration if possible. So there was a element that he had on the screen that wasn't aligning correctly. It was kind of off-centered and it wasn't aligned correctly. So he threw a class onto there, and then he went into the CSS and then messed around with the CSS to get it to where it's going to look correctly. And I saw that, I'm like, that's not right, because, while you did get the issue fixed, you just added technical debt to there, because now we have this class. If we ever need to change our overall look and feel, it's not going to look right. He just, we were using Bootstrap on the project, and Bootstrap had a method or a class that you could just add in there that would have aligned things correctly. And, so I showed him that and showed him, here's why we want to do it. And, here's what would happen if we left this in here. If we were to move to Bootstrap 4 or something, we would then have to remember to go back to that one piece of code to fix that class as well. So I think that we have to absolutely have our standards of what we think are acceptable, but not to make them too unrealistic or too overwhelming to where you bring a new person on, they have to worry about the project, they have to the sides of the project, they have to worry about your style guidelines, and they have to work with their, deal with their confidence of pushing up code to a bunch of seasoned people on that project. It's intimidating. So I think, having a onboarding guide or something that's, kind of short and concise to have the architectural layout of the standards of, if you have these kind of things, here's where they go. Have your style guidelines of, here's like your literal style, your CSS style guidelines. Try not to create a class with its own custom styling because we're going to then have to maintain it. Here's what projects or here's the frameworks we're using. You should be able to fit within those guidelines of that framework to get your styling done. Stuff like that.
And I like that if you're doing it that way, the way you're describing, Dave, what you're doing is you're maximizing the individual. You're saying, hey, let's make this as easy as we can for you to contribute and be part of this. And, if part of that culture is, hey, you got that one a little bit off, let's fix this. But we like your code, we like your thinking, then it's a lot easier to just keep norming together, coming together and seeing it together.
Now, occasionally, though, while you're norming together, so to speak, you're going to run into things where somebody, just absolutely disagrees. They, for whatever reason, it's like, no, this is an exception, or, what, this is just better. How do you handle those conflicts so that, things still conform? Because I don't feel like, and this is something that I've run into more in business, I guess, than in programming, but I've seen it in programming too, where it's, I just, it has to be done the way that we do things. And, somebody's not going to be happy about that. So how do you press the issue? Or do you, if it's not important, how far can you give in?
I'll tell you quick story. I'll see if I can anonymize it enough that I won't embarrass anybody. I had an experience once where we had that, where somebody said, it's got to be this way. And my go-to on that is, okay, convince me, show me, I'll ask specific questions and I'll let them have their case. And they were just for it, but it flustered them because what was going on was they felt like they knew a better way, but they weren't prepared at that time. So it turned into a really heated argument. And we cut it off after a couple minutes. We realized how bad this was getting. It really was not going to work. And so we went to our corners. I complained a little bit. He did too. And then we came back together later after he had time to think and I had time to think and figured it out. We at the end of the day, we had to grow up a little bit and say, all right, I understand that you didn't have on the top of your head 100 ideas that you haven't touched in the year. So when you get a chance, think about it and come explain to me what you think, and then I'll talk to you about it from the perspective of the project, and we'll come up with a plan together. What's best for the project, And it took that moment of, okay, we don't agree on a standard, and we don't agree on even almost anything right now. Our whole worldviews are completely different, but what we're going to do is find a way to have that conversation. It's an important one. This one changes everything. But yeah, it didn't come to blows, but I could imagine myself trying to take it down. It gets really heated really fast sometimes, and I tend to be passionate about my work, but not like aggressive, I hope, about my work. But that got that way when it's standards. And I think it has something to do with confidence and contribution and risks that we have in the project and whatever else is going on. But yeah, that I thought, at the end of the day, I count that person as a good friend of mine. And at the end of the day, we actually came up with a really good solution. But it did take a few rounds of, okay, let me reaffirm to you that what matters is the project, and I want to hear what you want to say. And he did the same for me, and we figured it out, and we came up with a good solution.
I think that's really interesting, too, that you started from the place of, we care about the project, we want it to succeed, and things like that. And, in a lot of the political dialogue that we see these days, right, it's, well, those people, they care more about this than bad things happening to people, right? And when it comes right down to it, a lot of these issues, I mean, if you get to the core of things, neither group wants bad things to happen to people. They just have a different perspective on how you get there. And, once you start having that conversation, which is, so we don't want bad things to happen to people, and here are the problems I see with your solution, and these are the problems you see with mine. You may not come to a compromise that anybody's really happy with, but at least you can come to the place where you understand each other, and you can get a lot of this together and be friends at the end of the day. And I think it's important, even though essentially somebody's going to have to overrule somebody else, you're coming from the place of, hey, look, we're trying to succeed here. We're trying to get things done. We're trying to make the project as easy to maintain or, as clear to work on, or whatever it is that we've set as a value as possible. And we know that our tools are imperfect and our communication's imperfect. So we're just going to get the best we can.
And I think it helps in situations like this to keep in mind, what game are we playing? Mm-hmm. If it's a zero-sum game, somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose. Right. But if it's a positive-sum game, hey, how do we find a way that we both win? Mm-hmm. And if we absolutely cannot find a way where we can both win, all right, somebody's got to lose, but let's do it in a way that somebody doesn't have to lose face, maybe. If it has to be one or the other, you can't have a baseball game. Every time somebody comes up to bat, somebody wins, somebody loses. That's the game. Sometimes that's okay, but it's a game. We have fun, and I don't know. In software, if winning and losing gets too caustic, it tends to. I think that the ugly face of that tends to be that the older, more senior people win, the junior people move on and go get paid more somewhere else, and that just breaks things up. So, trying not to get to that point is good too.
Yep.
And something I've learned in life, even though someone is presenting what is just truly a bad idea, there is positive and some good things that can be taken out of it. So a lot of that has to do, even though you are right, you are the senior person, you can just play the trump card and you're going to win no matter what. But if you stay closed-minded, even though you are correct, to not see the positives of what they are trying to bring, either what their way of thinking is that led them to that solution, or maybe just a couple little tidbits of that solution, then you're closing yourself off to growing as well. Mm-hmm. And absolutely. I think that, then you have no winners. You have a junior who's mad. You have the senior who is now just, kind of repetitively doing the work, not growing, and you're going to have losers all around. So I think that even in the case where there is a loser, there is a winner, everyone can benefit if you are approaching it humbly and if you are keeping an open mind to the situation and if you react to it correctly or well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's interesting to me that we're talking about this because this is important and it comes up a lot in every project I've been on. But I've got this friend that works in a company and they have a lot of women that work on the teams. And he keeps telling me that they don't have these problems. He's a senior dev and he's been around a long time. He says, Dave, you wouldn't believe. We're nice to each other. So, it's kind of an interesting thing that, we create problems, and I'm not saying that hiring women is the whole solution to that thing, but it seems like that's one of the positive benefits of having a more diverse or a more interesting team is that every single conversation gets to be more open and inclusive. We get to be aware of what we're saying and not just bulldoze each other. So anyway, that was something I've heard at least 10 times from a friend of mine that he's really, really happy where he's working and for that reason.
Yeah, I have a theory that, because we keep seeing more studies come out that show that more diverse teams tend to be more productive and, produce better. And I don't know that it's because any one group is necessarily better at anything else, but it forces you to confront some of these issues, right? And so then what winds up happening is you only go out and fight for the things that really matter,
Yeah.
and you learn to communicate about the things that are different in your backgrounds. And I think a lot of those things really kind of come to play in that. But the other thing is that then because you have such diverse backgrounds, yeah, somebody's going to come out with an idea that you would have never dreamed up because they just come from a different place in life. And, that's a good thing. I think a lot of times we see people talking about diversity and they're trying to make everybody the same automaton, and it just doesn't make sense. You're hiring those people because of who they are and what they have to offer. And that's the interesting part of the whole thing. It's not treating everybody the same. It's treating everybody the way they want to be treated. And then, bringing that in and making it a strength.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with both y'all. From one perspective as a parent, having my son just had his 3rd birthday. So I have a 4-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And each one of them requires a different type of discipline. And if I were to give them the exact same discipline for the quote crime committed, then one would just have taken it so poorly and it would have just destroyed them. Whereas the other one would have learned from it and became a better person for it. So I think that kind of diversity we really need, not from a punishment standpoint, but just from the perspectives that you guys are talking about, because I get really tunnel vision in what I'm working on, whether it's a feature or fixing a problem. And I, try to think of it from different perspectives, but I don't have that visibility always because I'm too connected to the issue. I'm in there working on it. I don't have that visibility from the outside perspective that a QA person would have or that someone else would have, that I need them to be on my team. I need their input. And I think as a developer or someone, some kind of artist, in a lot of ways, what we're doing is art with our code. To get that criticism, I think that, on ourselves, we have to make sure that we're open to take it. Because I remember, when I was younger, drawing something, and I was a horrible artist, not good by any stretch of the imagination, but someone would give me criticism like, that doesn't look right. That face looks really messed up or wrong. The perspectives are wrong. And I was greatly offended. I'm like, this is the best that I could do. I had the wrong mindset. I had the wrong state of mind. They were trying to help me to grow me, and I wasn't open to that. Mm-hmm. So, I still suck at art today. But, we just had to keep an open mind to others' perspectives.
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely. And I love that the ethos of Ruby is to create happy developers. Mm-hmm. It's like, we're here partly because we matter and our contribution matters, and learning how to make that matters.
Yep, absolutely. So we've been talking for about an hour. Is there anything else that's kind of critical to this conversation that we haven't hit?
I'm liking this conversation.
I know. We could almost do a part 2 on it, I think.
Yeah, probably. Hey, it's Thanksgiving break. Let's just stay here all day. All right. Well, maybe we'll think about revisiting it if listeners have ideas as far as, hey, I really liked your conversation. I want to hear what you think about this or that, or, you have some other idea for, how we can dig into this a little bit further. By all means, leave a comment on the show notes. You can also, if you go to devchat.tv at the very top, there's a link to Patreon. And if you contribute to Patreon, it'll tell you how to get into our Slack chat for devchat.tv. And anyway, so you can jump in there and you can also let us know there. I have decided to shut down the Ruby Rogues Parlay Slack and just move everybody over to DevChat because I've got multiple people who are in several of the Slacks, and then, in one or two of them, there's not enough conversation going on to really make it worth it. And so I feel like the wider audience will make that worth it. That's just kind of a weird public service announcement. But let us know. Let us know if you have other thoughts on this. Because, everybody has different perspectives and experience. And there's probably something that we just didn't think about that will benefit other folks. So, but yeah, let's go ahead and do picks. Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. I was going to say, Dave, do you want to go first? But that doesn't help here. So, Dave Kimura, do you want to start us with picks?
Oh, geez. I thought you were going to say David. Well, I can't remember what I picked last week, but one thing that I've been super happy with is Sentry.io for bug tracking and error tracking. There were some gaps in some of my products that I just never knew about. Users never reported. And then I started getting the error messages through Sentry. I'm like, oh, hey, yeah, that's a simple fix. I can get that fixed. And I just never would have known if I hadn't used that software. So super impressed with it.
Nice. David, what are your picks?
Yeah, so I have two today. The first one is just appropriate for our conversation. I went ahead and picked ThoughtBot's playbook. So you can read over that. I like it, but you can at least have an opinion about that, about how they handle some of these same things. And my other one is another book. It's A Spy's Guide to Strategy. Now, I'm going to warn you, this prose is terrible. This guy is annoying. But he's this ex-CIA agent that talks about what it's like in the field. And he's talking about how to create win-win games and what kind of games are we playing and how do you handle things. And I found it really fascinating, and it's an easy read. And it's his second book in a series. He's writing at least three. The first one is A Spy's Guide to Thinking, Spy's Guide to Strategy, A Spy's Guide to Negotiations. And so it's just a way to how he worked as a CIA agent. It was good. It was a good read.
Nice. I've kind of been dealing with a few things here that I've been playing with. One is, as I mentioned before, I've been working in the area of, building some software for podcasters. And it's just been really, really interesting. One of the things that I'm going to just pick that's not really like a linkable, buyable pick. So Eric, who's on this show, and Nate Hopkins, who I've been trying to get on this show forever. Nate was somebody that I worked with very early in my career. He was actually a mentor to me for the first year of my programming career. Anyway, I got together with them and just had a chat about this software, and they kind of helped me re-architect a lot of stuff. And so, even though I'm quote unquote a senior guy, I talk to other people who have more experience in these particular areas, and it really paid off. So I'm definitely going to pick just getting a second opinion, and just figuring a lot of that out. And then the other thing that I'm going to talk about here real quick is I've been looking to delegate some stuff. And so I just hired somebody on Upwork to do like a week's worth of work for me. Upwork.com used to be Odesk. I think they also bought Elance. So anyway, if you're looking for people to kind of get some basic stuff done for you, that's a great place to go. They're doing some WordPress setup for me and some outreach stuff for me. So anyway, I'm using a tool called Pipedrive to do my outreach these days, and I'm really liking it. So I'll pick that. And then I'll throw in one last pick I've been listening to The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson again. And that's because the third book in the series, Oathbringer, I think it's called, just came out. And so I'm listening to the whole series again because I started listening to it and I'm like, what's going on again? So anyway, so those are my picks. We'll have links to all that in the show notes. Thank you guys for coming.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Yeah, have a great Thanksgiving. I know that this will come out after Thanksgiving, but have a great Thanksgiving. or Christmas as this comes out, and we'll talk to you all next week.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.